And today we have with us Maka Black Elk coming to us from Pine Ridge Reservation. Maka, how are you?
Doing well, Robert. Good to be here.
Thank you so much. So, to start off, tell us a bit about yourself, your background.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, my name is Maka Black Elk. I am from Pine Ridge Indian Reservation here in southwestern South Dakota. I grew up in Menderson, which is a town sort of smack dab in the middle of the reservation, and grew up here, spent my entire educational life here, and attended Red Cloud Indian School, which is where I currently work as well. Red Cloud Indian School is a K through 12 Jesuit school here on the Pine Ridge Reservation, one of the only Jesuit schools on an Indian reservation in the country, though not the only American Indian Catholic school. And my experience after that was really, fell in love with education. I went on to get my undergrad from University of San Francisco, another Jesuit university. Did a stint teaching abroad. I taught in Japan for a year before returning and switching coasts to New York. I went to Columbia University for my master's degree in educational development and returned to Red Cloud and have been here ever since. I've been at Red Cloud for the past 7 years, working initially as a teacher in the high school to our students, jumping from there to being an administrator, director of curriculum and instruction for the schools. During that time, I also then started a program at the University of Notre Dame to earn a master's in educational leadership. And just this past summer, I have started a new position here at Red Cloud. And my new title is the Executive Director for Truth and Healing, which is a very new position, certainly a bit unprecedented, something that we're figuring out as we go. But the idea behind this initiative and this effort is to engage in what people commonly know as a sort of reconciliation process between the community of the reservation and Red Cloud Indian School, which was a former Indian boarding school, and certainly has that history that it's not dealt with in a really intentional way. So that is sort of the journey that has led me to where I am. But it's one that I found quite a powerful experience, and I'm really honored to be engaging in this effort.
Throughout your journey from one coast to another coast to a completely different country, did you always have a sense that you would take everything you learned and bring it back home?
Yes, absolutely. I think growing up, that was always a part of the conversation when talking to my family, talking to peers of mine. There was always a sense that no matter what you went and did in life, that you would always return home. And so it was never really a question that I would eventually return and sort of make my life here. I think there's always an opportunity to explore and do different things, but ultimately there was a great sense of responsibility and duty, I think, to return to my community. And I think that was just instilled from not only the environment of the education I received, which of course, the Jesuits and Catholic education are very much about social justice and very much about sort of giving back to your community. But it was also just from my family. I mean, my family was, my parents were both educated and also had opportunities outside of the reservation, but ultimately chose to return.
And you work at Red Cloud Indian School, and from what you and I have sort of discussed previously, historically, this was a boarding school, right? So it was, the state was cooperating with, would it be the Jesuits or would it be the local diocese? Sort of, what's the history with Red Cloud and its history as a boarding school?
Yeah, it's a certainly complicated history, but Red Cloud was absolutely one of many Indian boarding schools across the country that followed a similar sort of national policy, modeled off of the most notorious of them, Carlisle Indian School, industrial boarding school in Pennsylvania. And the practices were similar. The Lakota language was not allowed, hair was cut, cultural practices weren't inclusive, and there was a certain, I guess, more determined effort to forcefully attempt to convert Lakota people to Catholicism. The history of that is fascinating in its own way. I mean, under President Grant's peace policy, every reservation was sort of initially assigned a denomination of a Christian, area to who would receive federal funds and set up schools and missions. So Pine Ridge was actually initially assigned Episcopalian, but in, I think, 1873, that ultimately was rescinded, and there was more opportunity for different denominations to attain federal support and state support to set up schools and missions. And the Jesuits had made a very interesting relationship with Indigenous peoples early on in the Great Plains. The Jesuits, unlike a lot of other missionaries, but certainly not exclusively, had a very different way of engaging in the community. They learned Lakota language, and many of them actually gained near fluency through their time on the reservation. The Jesuits were really interested in exchange of ideas. And so there was relationship that was developed where a lot of Lakota people trusted the Jesuits, whom they called the Black Robes. And when Red Cloud himself, Chief Red Cloud, one of the leaders here in Pine Ridge at the time, sort of anticipated that a lot of change was coming, he petitioned especially for the Jesuits to come and set up a school, and asked, went to Washington DC and requested as much. And that's kind of how it started. But despite that initial, I think, relationship that the Jesuits had with the Lakota people, the school nonetheless developed in a way that was very similar to other boarding schools of its time. That ultimately changed over time, obviously, and certainly there was no one moment where there was a sort of light switch that changed the way the school operated and worked, but a number of factors contributed to a gradual shift to a much more, I think, inclusive and more collaborative effort between the Jesuits and Lakota people.
So that was actually going to be my next question was, how does it go from being a school that, you might say, suppresses the culture a little bit, to a school that actively works to engage the culture and incorporate, the local Lakota culture. So being that happened gradually over time, when it was first starting out and there was not a lot of dialogue, there's not a lot of collaboration, was the school not well received? I mean, if Chief Red Cloud was the one who requested the school, and then the youth of the time would have been subjected to cutting their hair or not being able to speak their language, was there any sort of resistance against the school that actually came to be?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately there was, and I think, we don't know the full picture yet, and that's part of this process of truth and healing, is to, in this first stage of the truth telling, which is the beginning of this process, when we go and seek out boarding school survivors to hear their stories, when we internally, learn about our own history, that means opening up our archives and actually looking at the records of what we have available. And that's a big process that will take some time. But from what I do know already, yes, like the Lakota children resisted. There were written reports from some of the Jesuits at the time about the runaways who would be, who would flee the facility. There were also times when attendance and participation was low, and the Jesuits actually requested local Indian agent support, police support, to go and apprehend children from their homes and forcefully bring them to Holy Rosary, which is the name of the institution at the time, Holy Rosary Mission. Now, that's not to say that, of course, it was all entirely that way, and sort of this that every student sort of felt that way, and every student tried to flee. Certainly, many students also just accepted it, and there were some families, of course, who purposefully and intentionally sent their children, largely because, you know, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, reservation life was incredibly difficult. The level of poverty and the rural nature of the area was so extreme that, you know, people were really reliant on government rations. Their homes were typically not, certainly not the kinds of the amenities that we know of today, right? There were sort of log cabins in the dirt in these very early times of the reservation. So parents would send their children out of just necessity, that they know they would have a place to sleep and a meal. So coercion, and certainly just the nature of the times, right? And I think that's something that's really important to understand about the Indian boarding school era, right? Like, when we think about these things, because I think many people out there who still work in these schools, especially Catholic schools, who are still operating today, really want to believe that Catholic boarding schools were different, and that they were they had to be better than maybe these other government schools and the practices that they may have done. But I think it's important just to recognize the context that all of these schools were created in, right? That this time in US history was very tumultuous, chaotic, and that Native people's lives were dramatically changed overnight, forcefully. And so this is the context that these schools are built in, right? This is the environment where these schools began. And I think eventually, of course, many students got used to it, adapted. You know, the young people survive, and there came out of those difficulties also many great relationships and stories, and certainly many boarding school survivors, while recognizing the challenge and the pain that they may have experienced, also simultaneously recognize that their boarding school experience gave them an education that they could then use later on. So it's a really complex relationship of factors that make the boarding school experience a challenging thing to sort of think about and talk about.
Right. And, you know, you don't have to search very far to see all of the other organizations that have really sprung up. And they're dedicated to having this conversation that Red Cloud is beginning with Truth and Healing. In Canada, is it the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I believe?
Yes.
And, you know, here in the US, there's a National Boarding School Healing organization as well. And I think the conversation surrounding this, there's a lot of hurt, I would say, that is being unearthed, that is sort of coming to the surface. It's a hurt that's maybe been there generationally. You know, they often call the boarding school period a source of generational trauma because of the long-lasting effects it had on how the culture and the language and even the rituals are passed down. A lot of our, you know, if you had grandparents or parents who were directly impacted by these schools, it affected the way that they received the culture, the way that they received their heritage. And so taking all of that, taking the national and international, if you want to acknowledge Canada and the US, what is the scope of what is being done at Red Cloud? Do you think is going to address simply the Red Cloud history, or do you think the goal is to explore the topic in a broader sense? What are the goals of this program here?
Yeah, I think, we've been very intentional about making sure that we're not setting up any sort of specific goal, because this process is really organic, because it really does stem from the community and the community itself, of survivors especially, who come forward and tell their stories, and have that space and that time and those resources to move toward healing. And we can't dictate that, and that's something we've been really trying to convey and be careful about as an institution, that we can't make anyone heal. And we certainly, being the perpetrator historically, right, of the injustice of boarding schools, we're very careful in sort of how we approach that. But nonetheless, we do sit at a very interesting place in this whole complex history, because yes, we were a specific boarding school that served this very specific community, chosen by community members, historically for different reasons, as I mentioned, but also because we were nearby. Like, we were an Indian boarding school that existed on the reservation in which it served, which is, many kids were sent even further away, depending on the boarding school situation. So we're very local in terms of who was impacted. At the same time, we are a part of this national dialogue around Indian boarding schools. We sort of share in the broader relationship that all Indian boarding schools have. And because, sometimes there's talk about, well, maybe we weren't that bad. Maybe we weren't as bad as Carlisle, for sure, right? Which is, of course, the most notorious one. We don't actually know that, right? But
Right.
the reality is that all the boarding schools have this sort of relationship in terms of just the impact of being an Indian boarding school. For us, it's also complex and challenging because we're Catholic, and part of a broader Christian worldview that came, and that many Native people, understandably so, still associate with negative colonialism, sort of this one-sided dominance in terms of how they view how Christianity and Catholicism came to this country and how it was introduced to different communities and tribes, in many cases forcefully. And so we are aware that, in one sense, this effort is very specific to our community, but we're attached to this national conversation around boarding schools that organizations like the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition are working on. But we're also tied to the broader Catholic Church, which we can't individually, as one body of the Catholic Church, certainly speak for the whole church. But I think we can do a lot to speak for individuals here in the community as they try to build a better relationship with the Catholic Church. And certainly we're the on-the-ground face of that. And so I think we have an opportunity here to address all of those different issues.
Yeah. And, I like what you said earlier, and you sort of corrected the way I was coming at this, and I appreciate that, in that the process is organic, right? And it may be hard to anticipate who from your community comes forward to tell their story and what sort of stories are going to be told. Like, you mentioned earlier that there are going to be varying degrees of perspective when it comes to how the individual families within your tribe, within your community were affected. You're going to have some who saw the benefit of the school, and ultimately, despite all of its misgivings and anything that may have happened that may have been unsavory or just remember negatively. There may be some who say, you know what, it was still a blessing. But then you'll have others who their experience was totally different. And, you know, being that this is an organic sort of movement, there has to be room for both perspectives, for really all perspectives. And so truth and healing, you're going to be in the truth period for quite some time, it sounds like, before, you know, the healing. It doesn't sound like you can put a timeline on that. Does that sound
No,
about right?
absolutely. I think sometimes in this work, there's a sense that, you know, healing will be achieved quite quickly, or that, you know, as soon as acknowledgement happens or an apology happens, that the healing is now here, and we can, you know, kind of wipe our hands at that and move happily forward. But the reality is that the beginning of this process, which is the truth-telling phase, is the most difficult part of the process. It's the most difficult part because it's the aspect of this work where there's even hesitancy to begin, both for certainly survivors of boarding schools who may be re-traumatized in having to sort of come to terms and think about their experience, and the hesitancy to even engage in that effort. But also certainly from the side of the institution and the Jesuits and the Catholic Church, in terms of the difficulty of listening to those stories, the difficulty in acknowledging the painful history, or of wanting to minimize it, or wanting to sort of counter with a but the good stories too, and as a sort of way of offsetting that. So that's a challenging place for everyone. But that's exactly why healing is not just for the boarding school survivors. Healing is, in fact, for everyone, including the Catholic Jesuit community here as well, who are also suffering in their own way from the legacy of the boarding school, in the distrust that might exist still between community members and the school, or the Jesuits, or the Catholic Church writ large, the animosity that may still exist. And certainly for Lakota, or sorry, Native Catholic people, you know, I myself, right, being both Lakota and Catholic, there is a certain amount of challenge when it comes to, when I talk to other Lakota people, and they ask me the question, like, why are you Catholic? Like, how could you be Catholic after, you know, the history that you well know? And being able to sort of be strong in my faith and still address that true history is a challenge. Not something that I certainly haven't figured out for myself, but is a broader conversation that Native American Catholic people also need to have within themselves, so that we can be able to sort of answer those kinds of questions with real honesty, and whilst also not being in denial of the history. And so everyone is involved in this process, and the healing is for everyone, but the most difficult step is the first one. And so that's definitely the challenge we face in the beginning, and is going to take lots of time. So we're definitely not rushing this. The thing I've always said so far in when we started this journey is we're planning for it to take from 5 years to forever, because it really could just, you know, be it really is a lifelong journey. There will be people who aren't even ready to, again, engage in the conversation, and bring up those stories. And then there are people who will live in the confrontational phase and never want to leave that phase. They'll still sort of carry that anger and won't be able to overcome it. And that's just a reality of the way in which we know reconciliation in other places has happened. So there's also important to say that there's not this sort of transformation that's going to happen overnight, where the entire community is going to now be healed. It's not going to be this one glorious moment, but every moment that every individual achieves their own sense of healing and closure is a success for everyone. And I think that's hopefully, if anything, the goal at the end of the day. I speak also as someone who is descendant of boarding school survivors. I mean, on both sides of my family. My grandparents on one side were their experience of Red Cloud or Holy Resurrection at the time was quite positive. And then on the other side of the family, I have boarding school surviving ancestors who had a very negative experience. One of my great-great-great-grandfathers went to Carlisle, Ben Black Elk, actually, the son of Nicholas Black Elk. So I have to think about how boarding schools have also impacted them and then subsequently me.